Today, I'm going to be lecturing you on courts, crime, and controversy. That will be chapter 1 of your textbook. Our learning objectives today. In this particular lecture, you're going to describe how the courts are related to the other components of the criminal justice system. We will discuss the major types of courts found in the United States, identify the most important actors in the courthouse. And when we are talking about actors in the courthouse, we are talking about the prosecutor, we're also talking about the defense attorney, we are talking also about the court clerks, and we're also talking about the judges and the bailiffs, everybody that participate in our court system. You also learn how to list the steps in a typical felony prosecution. You will be able to explain how a law in action perspective complements a law on the books approach to studying the criminal courts. Distinguish between the crime control model of the criminal justice and the due process model of the criminal justice. When we talk about the courts and the criminal justice system, we also have, in addition to courts, the two other main components of the criminal justice system. They are the police and the correction. We all know what the police are. Those are the people in your neighborhood wearing the uniform and driving the squad cars and patrolling your streets and your shopping centers and your government buildings. Everywhere you see them, we all know what the police are. Then we also talk about corrections. When we talk about corrections, we are basically talking about the prison system. Courts are related to the rest of the criminal justice system in the following ways. Number one, courts are interdependent. All have different goals, histories, and operating procedures, all forced to interact with one another. In other words, the courts interact with the prosecutor, they interact with the defense attorney, and they also interact with the people with regard to as the working groups in the court system. Courts are also fragmented. We have over 18,000 law enforcement organizations. Corrections encompasses the following: prisons, probations, parole, drug treatments, halfway houses, etc. In other words, etc. Court has many factors and actors, including private citizens. Tensions and conflicts. Under tensions and conflict, we have come from conflicting goals and perspectives. These are the major courts in the United States. Number one, we have the trial courts. Number two, we have the appellate courts. And number three, we have the United States Supreme Court. Under the trial courts, trials are held over there, jurors are sworn in, and witnesses are questioned. The lower courts, they deal with what? They process felony cases. Major trial courts, they are responsible for final phases of felony prosecution. Now let's move to the appellate courts. The appellate courts are the courts that review decisions made by trial courts, most often major trial courts. At the appellate courts, no trials are held. That's the number one. Number two, no jurors are employed. In other words, there are no jurors available or used in an appellate court. Also at the appellate court, there are no witnesses involved. The only thing that happens at the appellate court is where the lawyers argue over the previous case or cases that were appealed before the court. Now let's go to the U.S. Supreme Court. We only have one U.S. Supreme Court in the United States, and it's also otherwise known as Court of Last Resort. Cases are hand-selected. In other words, when we say cases are hand-selected, the Supreme Court at any given year, they always have close to about 8,000 to 9,000 cases being appealed from the appellate court to the U.S. Supreme Court. The court hears fewer than 85 cases a year. Looking at that number, that's 0.01 of a percent. Usually only hears cases impacting society as a whole. In other words, cases that requires constitutional interpretations. Here are the following actors in the courthouse. The most important actors in the courthouse include prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, defendants, and the victims. Now let's go down to the steps in a typical felony prosecution. In other words, when the district attorney brings a felony case, a serious case, against an individual or a corporation. Under that steps, the number one steps is a crime has to have been committed, whether it's a felony crime or a misdemeanor crime. Then the next step is arrest. After arrest come initial appearance in the court, a bail hearing, grand jury will be selected to see if they're going to bring a case against the individual. Preliminary hearings, and then followed by arraignment. We have discovery. Discovery has to do with everything that whether the prosecutor and the defense needs to use in their case, all the information that needs to be gathered before the trial starts, all the witnesses that they will need to show up to prove their case or against their case, pre-trial motions, plea negotiation, and then we go to trial. After trial, what do we have? We have pre-sentence investigation. This is when the court would order the probation department to do a pre-sentence investigation as to an individual that is found guilty of a crime, whether they deserve to get a probation or go to prison, or a combination of both. If a guilty verdict sentencing, then whether they could appeal or a possible appeal of the case. Now, let's go down to law on the books and law in action. Law on the books. Those are legal and structural components of the judiciary. Where do we get our law from in the United States? We get our laws from what? The number one thing is the Constitution of the United States. We also get our law from legislation. In other words, we get our law under the federal legislation. We get our laws from members of Congress. In other words, your House of Representatives and the Senate. You also get legislation on the state level from your legislative representatives at the state level, at the House level, and at the Senate level in your local states. We also get laws from where? From regulations. An example of the regulation, we have the occupational agency that regulates how businesses supposed to keep the environment safe. And then we also have laws in action. They focus on human factors governing the actual application of the law. So who are the people in laws in action? We have the police, the prosecutors, the judges, the victims, witnesses, and jurors. Our next topic deals with crime control model and the due process model. The controversy surrounding cases can be compared through two criminological concepts. One of them is the crime control model, and the second one is the due process model. What do we mean when we say the crime control model? That is a conservative model. In other words, these are people that believe that every criminal should just go to prison. Once we find them guilty, just throw away the key. Don't worry about trying to appeal the case for them. They also believe in proposing harsher penalties and sentences for individual criminals as a form of penalty. The due process model of criminal justice is basically what is otherwise known as the liberal model. You could compare this similar to the belief of the conservative, which is more Republican, and the liberal model, which is more Democratic. Under the liberal model, they advocate social programs aimed at reducing crime by reducing poverty. They also believe that every right of a prisoner must be closely, or a criminal element must be closely respected and adhered to during the trial. The crime control model and the due process model, like I said, one proposes harsher penalties, and the other one proposes social factors in helping criminals move back into the society, and not harsh prison sentence. The crime control model advocates individual responsibility. In other words, if you do the crime, you do the time. It also advocates self-control. Also, individual has to be disciplined enough on their own not to commit crime. They also want the court to quickly determine innocence or guilt. Informal fact findings is foolproof. In other words, they don't have to go through every legal system before they could find proof. Even if they miss a step, they really don't care about it. Speed and finality of the court. In other words, you go through the trial quickly, and they want the courts to come to a quick conclusion. Courts hinder effective law enforcement. They see court as hindering effective law enforcement and provide inadequate protection for society. Under the due process model, let me give you a breakdown. They are there to protect the rights of the individual. Social influences, formal fact finding. They believe that everything has to be done legitimately and at the correct steps, with careful consideration of each case. Considers the court to find errors on the part of law enforcement and prosecutors. In other words, what they're saying is, if the police or the prosecutor makes an error at any level of the prosecutorial concept, then they want the whole attention to be brought before the court and the judge. They also advocate community-based sentencing. Now, let's go down to media depictions or distortions of criminal courts. In other words, what the TV, the newspaper, the magazine, all things about our court system, whether good or bad. Most people in the US, as you know, we all learn about process of criminal courts through the media. We see people being tried in the media. As of right now, we were watching the ex-police guy in California that was raping women in the 70s and 80s, all the way to the upper 90s, get sentenced to life in prison yesterday in California. We all see all that on TV. What we don't see on TV, well, what else do we see? We see it in magazines. We see it online now in our own social media. People are able to understand influences on the outcome of the case, such as an example would be a celebrity case. What do we see nowadays? We saw the lady right there in Boston went to court, all those actors and actresses that were paying for their keys for somebody to take exams for them so they can get to some very expensive schools like UCLA, and some of them forge some sports participation paper so they can get them through or get admitted to those Ivy League schools. Now, what happened? They are paying the price for them. Some of them are going to be spending about two months in prison, and the husband of one of the players is going to be spending 5 months in prison. They were both sentenced yesterday at the federal court in Boston. And then when you also look at the advantages we see about the media, the influence of laws on the books, the influence of laws in action, influence of law in controversy also exists. What are the disadvantages of what we see when it comes to media distortion or depictions? The media can distort reality to make the proceedings seems more dramatic. And that concludes the chapter 1 lecture for this particular class.